Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are finally going to do another Halloween creature. I thought it'd be really fun to do the Raven from Game of Thrones. If you've ever watched the series, you've probably noticed that there is a three-eyed raven that every now and again shows up in the series. It's supposed to point out times of when things are just supposed to go horribly wrong, and I thought that would be something fun to make. Anyways, let's get started. Okay guys, I think the first thing we're going to work on is going to be the sewing for our raven's body. So like normal, I'm going to show you guys the pattern pieces that I drew out for this piece, and then we're going to start on the sewing for it. So right here I have the main body of the raven. I have the legs separated so we could do the inside parts, and then I have the wing piece right up here. This is just going to be the top of the wing. We're going to make the feathers and stuff out of felt later. And then our raven is going to have a back piece and a belly piece. These are pretty much the same pattern, except one of them I extended a little bit because the measurements needed it to be a little bit longer. So for our fabric pieces, you're going to need a left and a right body piece, and then you'll need a top piece for each wing. For this, I took the same pattern and I just made a mirror image of it, and I decided to leave them connected to save on sewing. And then you have your belly piece along with the inside parts of the legs, and then the final piece of fabric you'll need is the piece that goes down the back. So the first bit of sewing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take the inside parts of the legs and I'm going to lay them out on the legs that are on the main body piece, and we're going to sew down the front connecting the two pieces together. We're going to leave the back open because this piece is going to have a wire frame and it just makes it a whole lot easier to put it together. Next, we're going to take the belly piece, and then we're going to take one of our side pieces and we're going to sew it to one side of the belly piece, and we're going to do the same thing to the other side piece. And that's pretty much all the sewing that we can do right now. We need to leave the back piece off, that way we can put everything onto a wire frame, and it's just going to be a lot easier to leave an opening in the back than to try and squeeze everything through the neck hole. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to making the wings and the tail feathers. Each wing is going to have only 2 layers of feathers because we're working with a lot of black, so you're not going to see a ton of detail if we do a whole lot of layers, so I kind of left it a little bit minimal. So I have one pattern that I drew out, which is going to be the more extended feathers, the longer and bigger ones, and then I have another pattern that's going to go on top of this that's a little bit smaller to create a nice layering. And then we're going to do the same thing to our tail feathers. So I'm going to use these patterns to cut out all my felt pieces, and then we're going to use our E6000 and start gluing everything together. After we have our felt feathers glued together, we're going to now take that fabric piece that's going to go on the top of the wing. So I'm going to take my E6000 and I'm going to glue it onto one side, and then I'm going to fold it over and glue it onto the other side of the wing. Now you'll notice that I did not put glue on the very top of the wing, I only did it on the sides. That's because we're creating a nice little pocket, that way we can run a wire through the wing. After we have everything glued together, we're going to set everything aside to dry for a little bit. But in the meantime, we can start on our clay pieces. So I kind of feel like working on the raven's feet first, and then we can move on to the head. So I have a pair of little wire frames set up for the feet, and the first thing we are going to be doing is we're going to sculpt some claws onto this, and then kind of put a little bit of clay over where everything's connected to kind of help protect and lock everything in, so it holds still when we add all the other details. So I'm just going to take a little bit of clay and cover up that spot where we have all the wires connected, and then I'm going to take a little bit of clay and I'm going to roll it into a tiny cone shape and put it at the end of each wire. I'm going to use my fingers and possibly some of my tools. Usually I don't need them for this, and then I'm just going to kind of shape them into the shape of a claw. I'm going to try and keep everything on these feet really thin because I tend to make really bulky bird feet, and I kind of want the raven's feet to be nice and delicate. After we have all that in place on the wire frame, we're going to bake this for a little bit in the oven. So I'm going to set my oven for 275 Fahrenheit and bake this for probably 20 minutes, just enough so our clay can harden and we don't have to worry about bumping and ruining our progress. After everything is done baking and is cool to touch, we can start working on more detail. So I'm going to do the bottoms of the feet first, and then we're going to bake again, and then we're going to start adding detail to the tops of the feet. So I'm going to start by taking little strips of clay and I'm going to lay them onto the wires and start covering up the wires on the bottom side. Again, I'm trying to keep everything really delicate, so I'm not using a whole lot of clay for this. After I have everything covered, I'm going to use my tools and stuff to try and add some wrinkles and different details to it. Once I have the bottoms of all of my toes completely covered and sculpted, I'm going to put these again in the oven at 275 Fahrenheit for probably another 20 or maybe 25 minutes. Okay, our clay is out of the oven again and is cooled, and we can start working on the scales for the very tops of the feet. So for the scales on the top of the raven's feet, these tend to be kind of squared, so I'm going to try and square off my little scales. At first, of course, I'm rolling them into little balls and placing them, but I'm going to use my tools to square everything up after we have everything placed. So I'm going to do this to all of the front toes, and then once I get to the very base of the foot, we're going to start going up the wire. So I'm going to cover the back of the leg with some clay, and then I'm going to continue the scales going up the leg. Once I have everything completely covered, of course I'm going to use my tools to adjust the shape of everything and just make sure everything is nice and cleaned up. And then we can put these in the oven for one final bake, again 275 Fahrenheit, and we're going to probably put this in for about 45 minutes. Now we're going to move on to making our raven's face. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use tin foil for a base of it, I'm going to roll it into a nice tight cone, and then we're going to start covering this in clay. Once we have it completely covered, we're going to smooth everything out, and then we can start adding our details to it. So the first bit of detail that we are going to work on is going to be separating the beak into a top and a bottom. So I'm going to use one of my tools to draw out where I want the separation. Remember, the top beak is going to be a lot larger than the bottom of the beak. So I'm going to make sure this is nice and even, and then I'm going to straighten everything up and make sure the lines are really nice and crisp. Now normally with birds you can see their nostrils, but with ravens they have these long, kind of more like hair-like feathers that go over the very top of their beak, and they kind of cover those up, so we're not going to focus on sculpting those. We're now going to move on to the eyes. So I'm going to place the two side eyes first, that way I can get them nice and even, and then I'm going to place the third eye right in the middle. Now since we're working with 3 eyes instead of 2, I need to make sure they're spread out throughout the face nice and evenly, and they're not like bunched together to look kind of weird. I want to make it look as natural as possible, even though having 3 eyes is very unnatural. Once I like the position of all the eyes, I can now move on to making the eyelids and kind of finishing everything up. So I'm going to take little strips of clay and I'm going to frame around all the eyes, and then I'm going to kind of use my tools to make them look a little scaled like. Now that's basically all the sculpting I need to do for the face. It was really simple, mainly because we're going to end up covering a lot of the face in fur fabric, so you're not going to see anything else, so you mainly want to focus on the details that are going to show up. Of course, you do want to make sure the shape is correct, because even though it's covered in fur fabric, it is going to make a certain shape under the fur fabric. So we're going to put our raven's head in the oven for probably about 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. After all of our clay pieces have baked and cooled, we can start on the painting. Okay, so for the painting, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to primer all of my clay pieces. And because we're dealing with a raven, which is nice and black, we're going to primer everything with a nice layer of black. So I'm just going to go over everything with black paint. I'm going to let it dry. If I need to do extra layers, I'm going to add that. But once I have a nice even coating of black, we're going to start on the detail. So for our feet, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on painting the scales on top of the feet. So I'm going to take that same black and I'm going to add a little bit of white to it just to make it look a little lighter. And then I'm going to paint over the scales, making sure to avoid the little cracks in between. That way there's black separating the gray scales. Now I did add a little bit of dark brown around the claw just to add that little bit of detail to separate the claw from the foot. That way it's a little bit more distinguishable. Lastly, I'm just going to add a little bit of a white highlight, and then our feet are done and we can move on to the face. Now with the face, we aren't going to be painting the whole face, we're going to be painting the beak first, and then once we have everything put together, then I'm going to be painting the eyes. I just found it was going to be a lot easier, since we're furring the face, to paint the eyes after it's all put together. But even though we're going to wait on painting the eyes, I am going to primer them as well. Now for the face, I'm not going to be using black to cover everything up with a nice layer. I'm going to be using a brown, mainly because I'm not trying to get a jet black beak. I'm trying to get more of a purpley hue, so I'm going to kind of start off with a brown color, and then I'm going to start adding like blues and different things to the black that we're going to add later, just to try and get it to look a little bit more distinguishable from all the black fabric and stuff. I want it to be a different tint. Now this little bit of extra detail probably doesn't show up very well on camera, but in person it does have a bit of a purple tint that I'm really happy with. Anyways, we are going to let the paint on our feet and our beak dry, and then we're going to apply a thin layer of resin over everything to lock everything in, avoiding the eyes, of course, because we haven't finished painting those yet. So these are going to have to dry overnight, and then we can start putting everything together. Okay, it's the following day and we can start putting our raven together. So the first thing we need to do is we need to put our feet on the wire frame. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that fabric body that we already made, we're going to flip it right side out, and we're going to run the wires that we have for our simple little wire frame through those legs and connect our legs to the end of the wires. So we're going to take a thinner wire and use the little bit of wire that's hanging out of our foot and connect it to the wire frame. So we're just going to wrap it. We're going to do this to both feet, making sure they're nice and secure. After that, we can use our glues. I'm mainly going to be using E6000 glue and a little bit of hot glue to hold things into place while the E6000 dries. So I'm going to use my glue and I'm going to glue the fabric for the legs all the way around the base of the foot. I'm going to let that dry a little bit and then I can sew the back of the foot closed because there is a little bit of an opening at the very back. Now we can add the tail feathers to the back end of the raven. Now I have a little bit of a wire sticking out of our wire frame to go into this, that way you can kind of position it a bit more and they don't just flop down. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the fabric for the very bottom of the tail and I'm going to glue that to the wire frame, and then I'm going to glue the felt feathers on top of that, sandwiching the wire between the two pieces. Now is when we can add that back piece to the raven. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue the end of it to the very top of our tail feathers. Once that's in place, we can now start sewing up the sides of the raven. So I'm going to use my needle and thread and I'm going to sew down each side of the back piece until I want to stop and add the wing. Of course, while I'm sewing the body, I am stuffing it lightly as we go just to make it a lot easier. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our wings and we're going to sew it to the body. So the first thing, we're going to sew the bottom of the wing to the sides of the body. And then after that's in place, we're going to run the wire into the wing and sew the very top of the wing onto the back part of the body. And then once the wings are in place, we can continue sewing going up the neck. Now we can finally add the head to the piece. So I'm going to take a little bit of glue and I'm going to glue our head to the end of the wire frame for the neck, and then after that's dried we can start gluing the fabric around the base of the head. Of course, I haven't sewn the neck completely closed at this point, so I'm going to stuff that and then I'm going to continue sewing until we're all closed up. Now that our raven is all put together, we can finally start finishing up the face. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to start furring the face. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my E6000 glue and I'm going to paint it onto the face where I want the fur to be. And then I'm going to use little bits of fur trimming from our fabric and I'm going to start covering the face. So I'm just going to sprinkle it on and then I'm going to use my fingers to push it into the glue and make sure it's completely covered. So we're going to do this all the way around the face until we have everything covered, and then when it comes to covering the very top part of where the beak is, remember there's little like long feathery hair-like pieces that cover the nostrils. Well, we're going to take longer cuttings of our fur fabric and we're going to glue those into place. Once we have our face completely furred, we're going to let that dry for a few hours and then we can finish up the eyes by painting them. For the eyes, I do want them to pop out a little bit, so I'm not going completely black with them. I'm going to have them have a bit of a kind of a rusted iris, and then I'm going to give them a nice black pupil and add some white highlights to them. And then of course I do have to paint the eyelids. I'm just going to go over them with a little bit of a gray and a black just to make a highlight and a low light so you can kind of see them a bit better. After we're done painting the eyes, we're going to apply a layer of resin over them just like we did with the other clay pieces and let that dry. And then once that's dried overnight, we have a finished raven. Okay guys, and that's how I made the three-eyed raven from Game of Thrones. I had so much fun making this. I'm going to have him along with a bunch of other creatures in my Etsy shop, so make sure to check the links down below for that if you want to buy anything. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!